Hello, my name is Caroline Doyle and welcome to There's Not Just a Gap, It's a Chasm, disability support for people who are or have been in prison. This webinar was drafted on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, the Wiradjuri and Bunurong peoples and the Turrbal Aboriginal tribe. I'm presenting today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. The researchers from this project acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and we pay respect to their elders, past and present. We extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Today, you will see that we have Auslan interpreters working with us. We also have live captioning. What happens to someone's NDIS package when they're in prison? This was a question I had raised numerous times with people from government and non-government organisations in my role as the President of Prisoners Aid here in the ACT. I thought this would have been a pretty easy question to answer. However, upon raising this question, I was often met with the response, I'm not really sure, maybe you should speak to so-and-so. After getting this response a couple of times, I approached some colleagues at the Public Service Research Group here at UNSW Canberra, who I knew did work in the disability policy space, Professor Helen Dickinson and Dr. Sophie Yates. So rather than replying with, we're not sure, why don't you approach so-and-so, they, like good researchers, replied with more questions. How do people working in prison environments even know how many people in the prison actually have a disability? And for example, do we even know what screening tools are used in prisons? They said to me. Helen, Sophie and I realised that answering these sub-questions wasn't very easy either. We came to understand that the intersection of disability and correctional services is an under-researched area in Australia. So next slide, please. But what do we know? Well, we know that the prison rate in Australia has increased from almost 30,000 people in 2010 to almost 43,000 people in 2021. We know that disability can be physical, cognitive, or intellectual, or psychosocial, and that the prevalence of people in the community with intellectual disability is around 3%. However, the proportion of people in prison with intellectual disability is higher than this. For example, here in the ACT, 28% of people screened positive for an intellectual disability. A 2019 self-report survey found that 30% of people in the prison identified as having a disability. So up north in Queensland, studies from 2015 found that the reported rate of intellectual disability in adult prisoners is 9%. A more recent 2017 study found that 22% of formerly incarcerated people screened positive for an intellectual disability. In a 2021 paper prepared for the Disability Royal Commission, Leanne Dowles and colleagues said up to 15% of people in prison have an intellectual disability, while 25 to 30% of people in prison are estimated to have a borderline intellectual disability. Studies in 2012 and 2017 found that Indigenous people with intellectual disability are particularly overrepresented in prison, therefore making them the highest risk group for the co-occurrence of cognitive disability and imprisonment. So whilst we might not know exactly how many people in prison have a disability, we do know that it represents a significant proportion of the increasing Australian prison population. We also know that people with disability are often criminalised as a direct result of their imprisonment. So realising the challenges we were facing in understanding this under-researched area, we brought on another colleague, Dr. Fiona Buick, who has experience in the disability policy space, and Dr. Shannon Todd, given her criminology background. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we were granted funding from the Public Service Research Group at UNSW Canberra to investigate these 6 questions. Firstly, how are people in prison identified? Secondly, what supports are provided to them and as they return to the community? Thirdly, to what extent are NDIS services provided in prison? Fourthly, are these supports sufficient? Fifthly, what challenges or obstacles may prevent a person from accessing their NDIS support? And lastly, how can the needs of people in prison with disability be better met? We knew that the best people to help us answer these questions would be those working at the intersection of the disability and criminal justice space. Next slide, please. The seminar today and the report that will be launched draws from interviews with 28 stakeholders and one written submission from people working in government and non-government organisations at the intersection of disability and criminal justice systems in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT. Next slide, please. So these participants came from a range of backgrounds such as community legal organisation, human rights commissions, the police and advocacy organisations. So they participated in online interviews from September to November 2021. So I understand that some of the participants are joining us today and we'd like to thank them again for taking the time to speak to us. We know that this was a very challenging time given the many lockdowns across ACT, Victoria and New South Wales in 2021. So we asked participants about their involvement with and perceptions regarding 3 areas. The first area is people with disability who have been suspected, accused or convicted of committing a criminal offence. The second area is the processes used in the criminal justice system to identify a person's disability. And the third area is the adequacy of services and support for people with disability as they navigated the criminal justice system. So next slide, please. So you'll hear from Shannon, Sophie and Helen today about the findings from this research. You'll firstly hear from Shannon, who will discuss how people with disability in Australian prisons are often forgotten and how prisons often overlook, compound and further punish people with disability rather than viewing disability as a cause or explanation for their offending behaviour. You'll then hear from Sophie, who will explore how while policy permits some NDIS funding services to be delivered in prisons, in practice there's variation about what is possible and many issues with implementation. You'll then hear from Helen, who will discuss issues relating to people accessing and using NDIS plans once they leave prison. Helen will also present some research and policy recommendations from our research. So lastly, Dr. Mindy Satori from the Justice Reform Initiative will join us. So Mindy has over 20 years of experience working in the criminal justice system, and she'll provide some insights into what organisations working on the ground can do to ensure that people with disability involved with the criminal justice system have their needs better met. So following Mindy, we'll have some time for Q&A, as I'm sure many of you will have questions, and I hope that we have the answers about what participants have told us about what it could be like for someone in prison with a disability and their experiences post-release. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box and Fiona will be monitoring the chat. So as you'll see today, for disability services in and after prison, there's not just a gap, there's a chasm. That is, for people with disability in prison, their needs are quite often not met. More needs to be done to provide this group of people with support they not only need, but also deserve to be part of the community and to stay out of contact with the criminal justice system. So I'll now hand you over to Shannon, who will discuss the first finding from this research, how people with disability in Australian prisons are often forgotten.
Thank you for that, Caro. Next slide for me, please. So the first key area that we were interested in relates to the supports that are available for people with disability while they are in the custody of corrective services. Here, there were 3 overarching research questions that we wanted to answer, and they are shown here. Firstly, how well do prisons do in identifying people in prison with disability? And then what forms of support or accommodation is made for those individuals? And then finally, are educational or behavioural change programs suitable for the needs of this particular cohort? Next slide, please. So we know that entry to prison represents a chance for individuals to be assessed for disability. What we heard though from our interviewees was this was often largely a missed opportunity because correctional staff often do not screen or otherwise attempt to identify if a person does have a disability. Several of our interviewees even spoke about individuals who had a long history with the criminal justice system, people who they were assessing as part of the forensic disability program who were in their 50s and their 60s, who had been part of corrections for a long time and where there was evidence to suggest that that person might have a disability. And yet they were getting to those later years in their life before that was even identified. Because there were most often no screening tools or formalized assessments, prison staff often had to rely on prisoners to self-disclose their disability. Now, they recognise that this can be a little bit of a strange process when we're talking about the prison environment, because people would very often refuse or fail to acknowledge that they had a disability. Now, there could be several reasons for this, including, as one of our interviewees told us, that they may feel like admitting to having a disability might make them a target or mean that they may be treated differently. So when a person did not self-report or disclose their disability, the responsibility then fell back to corrections staff. This is difficult because those staff were often not trained in these sorts of areas. Identification was easier, our interviewees said, if a person had an obvious physical disability or they were very unwell or significantly impaired. However, otherwise, it was very difficult to ascertain. And relying on identification by prison staff was seen as problematic and prone to error, as a manager from a prisoners organisation told us. Maybe 1 in 100 times you would actually hit the nail on the head and accurately diagnose somebody. Next slide, please. The second area we were interested in was the support for people in prison with disability. Again, it wasn't a very good news story. We heard that there was generally a lack of support to assist people in prison with disability with their needs. Several of our interviewees commented that people with disability were at times housed in protection units or in management units. One of our interviewees, for example, reflected on a client who had significant behaviours of concern, who was managed in the management units for 23 hours a day with no contact. And they reflected that this was because the prison staff just didn't know how to manage that individual and their behaviours. Now, our interviewee said the best case scenario really was for a person to be housed in a disability-specific prison unit. These aren't available at every prison and there are limited beds. So most often people with disability were housed in the mainstream units. In those units, there was little disability support available. And so individuals had to rely on what was called peer support, meaning support provided by the other people in prison. This was recognised as really quite inappropriate and potentially dangerous, a situation that could create a whole lot of dependencies and power imbalances. And a senior government complaints official told us that they had received complaints about this, both from the prisoners who didn't have the support that they needed, but equally from their colleagues who complained that they were essentially being asked to do unpaid work. Next slide, please. The final area we were interested in this part of the findings related to the programs that are available for people in prison with disability. Now, again, our interviewees said that there were a lot of improvements that needed to be made in this particular area. They said there was a lack of individualised assistance and materials very often were not provided in plain English. They also spoke about how people with disability often had to rely on corrections staff to help them to complete the types of programs that they might need for parole, for example. Now, if that staff member was willing, that could work quite well. But if a person didn't have that support, it meant that they may not, for example, make it to parole. We were also told that there was an over-reliance on written materials for self-paced learning. Now, this meant that people were often provided with pamphlets or booklets to read in their cells. Interviewees recognised, look, yes, that's a cost-effective approach. It's easier to manage when you're dealing with these sorts of populations rather than trying to move people around the facilities. However, they noted that it required people to have a certain level of literacy and cognition. As our government victim support officer reflected, the information also is not accessible, and it posed a disadvantage to people who had low literacy. And then finally, an interviewee reflected on the fact that programs were not specifically designed for people with intellectual disability. And instead, they told us that what they would do is simply dumb down the material to make it more accessible for people with learning difficulties, for example. So overall, we found that there are many areas for improvement and many areas for concern, and lots of things for corrections agencies to consider moving forward. I will now turn over to Sophie, who will talk to us about NDIS packages and what happens when somebody is detained or in prison. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. And thanks, Sally, for the slide. So obviously, one of the key things that we wanted to look at with this research, and really what kicked it off in the first place, was what happens to an NDIS package when someone goes into prison? And can someone get NDIS services in prison? The knowledge on the ground seemed to be thin, except that services, it was considered, weren't at the level that they should be. So as far as what policy says, overall, the NDIS only covers some of the needs of people with disability in certain settings. Other needs are required to be covered by mainstream services such as health or justice or education or transport. And those services have to make reasonable adjustments so people with disability can access them. And there is often a bit of a problem with this interface and making sure that there are no gaps between what the NDIS provides and what the mainstream services provide. Next, please. So there are a few different policy documents that set out what happens with the NDIS in custodial settings. But what I've got up here is the most recent policy document, which is a public-facing document written for the community, setting out the responsibilities of the criminal justice system and the NDIS. And it says that the justice system is responsible for the day-to-day needs of people in prison with disability. Next. And then it says that the NDIS funds reasonable and necessary supports that aren't the responsibility of the justice system, and that it's appropriate for the NDIS to provide, which Council at the Disability Royal Commission pointed out last year is not all that clear for a public-facing document, but it does give some examples. So things like some types of assistive technology, staff training related to supporting your disability, and capacity building for the purposes of transitioning out of prison. And the second arrow there points to it. It's saying that the justice system basically gets to decide what supports can be provided. So it's at the discretion of the facility you're in, what you're allowed to receive. Next. So here's what happens when we asked our interviewees what's NDIS services that people could get in prison. A pretty common response was that they weren't sure, it was opaque, it was a grey area, and also that it can be hard to get good information about what's possible. Next. A fairly common response also, probably the most common response, was that a person's plan just stops when they go into custody and nothing happens while they're inside, and that it restarts again when they get out, but often there's quite a delay there. Or even that supports that should be possible, like capacity building or service coordination, can be refused by the NDIS, saying, you know, you're in prison, that's your responsibility. Next, please. And then some people did know of NDIS services that had been organised or had done that organisation themselves, but often at great effort, with a lot of coordination required and with a lot of variability in what was possible between one client and the next client. Like PO9 there, who worked for a state government-based forensic disability service, they said they'd love to know what we, the research team, found out about what was possible with the NDIS, because they'd had some clients with great support and others who got nothing. Next. Next, yep, thank you. It did seem increasingly possible recently, especially in the last couple of years, to have service coordinators and support workers and allied health people go into prisons to support release preparation. But this still didn't seem to happen often. And a few people talked about good outcomes that had been achieved with the help of initiatives at the state level that facilitated things between the justice system and the NDIS, or people who were employed at the state level to advocate for individual clients. So someone in Victoria mentioned a MACNI panel, which is the Multiple and Complex Needs Initiative, and said that that was very helpful with getting NDIS service happening. Next. And we thought a bit about the barriers and enablers that came through our interviews. And a big barrier seemed to be the potential for what people needed to clash with what prisons could or would allow. So even if something is technically allowed in the NDIS rules, it might not happen if the prison vetoes it, or even if the prison just doesn't facilitate it. And there's also just a huge amount of coordination required between the various parties. And the NDIS has acknowledged that. They've done, I'd say, a lot of work in this area. They have justice liaison officers now to help with this boundary, but the JLOs work at more of a systemic level than a client level. And there are also the state-based boundary spanners that I mentioned earlier that seem to be a useful enabler. But in general, people talked about how much work it was to get anything at all happening, if anything at all could happen. And prisons might not even know which people have NDIS plans and which don't. As that quote from P23 shows, P23 was a government disability advisor who went into a prison and sort of uncovered a whole bunch of people who had NDIS packages that the prison didn't know about. Next. And then there's the problem of what someone called buck passing, with the NDIS only funding services related to disability needs and not criminogenic needs. But our participants told us that it's often impossible to disentangle the two. There's kind of siloed mindset required that doesn't make sense to them who are providing services to the whole person. So there can be a funding standoff with, like, maybe the service not even being provided in the end. And the fact that because the NDIS has become the only game in town, sucking up all the disability service oxygen, it's quite hard to get disability-related supports that aren't on the NDIS, but prisons are still supposed to play the main role in supporting people with disability. And lastly, choice and control can be a problem in two ways. Firstly, making good use of the NDIS means being an informed consumer and knowing what you want, understanding your needs, being able to make decisions for yourself. Whereas in some ways, being in prison is the exact opposite. So it's kind of hard to reconcile the two mindsets. And providers in a market-based systems, service providers have choice and control too. They can say, I don't want to come into prisons. I don't want to work with that client. It's all too hard and it's not profitable. Several people talked about how there's no provider of last resort who can guarantee a service, at least not in their jurisdiction. So that's just a whirlwind tour of some of the issues associated with NDIS services in prisons. And I will pass over to Helen for the next bit.
Helen speaking. Thank you, Sophie. So Sophie and Shannon have both talked about disability services and NDIS in a prison context. I'm going to now move on and think about what happens post-release in terms of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Next slide. So the sorts of questions we were interested in here are: what degree are formerly incarcerated people with disability able to access the NDIS? Are there any particular challenges that are faced in terms of navigating the scheme and in using plans? And really picking up a theme from Sophie's presentation, choice and control is an ethos of the NDIS, but to what degree can formerly incarcerated people express that? And can they use choice and control to direct their services? And I think a really important point to make against the background of what I'm going to talk about in terms of our findings around those questions is interviewees reiterated to us again and again the importance of disability support to prevent people from either reoffending or from being re-engaged with the criminal justice system. And again, this picks up one of the themes that Sophie talked about, in the sense that it can be really difficult to disentangle what are behaviours related to an impairment and what are around criminogenic needs. And so there's this real sense that it's really crucial that we get disability supports right after prison to prevent people from getting trapped in these cycles of coming in and out of incarceration. Next slide, please. So one of the first challenges that we found in terms of accessing the scheme is, first of all, knowing that you have a disability and you're eligible for the scheme. As both Sophie and Shannon talked about, people who often get engaged with criminal justice schemes have kind of fallen through the gaps of services their entire life and have never been identified as having a disability, or that the behaviours that they express may in some way relate to a disability. And so if you don't know you have a disability, you're not going to know that you're eligible for the scheme either. And then we also know, it's fairly well established in literature, that there's an administrative burden associated with the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So there are a bunch of forms that you need to fill out to demonstrate your eligibility. And you also need to go and get evidence from professionals like doctors and other clinicians to demonstrate this. And as one manager of a prisoners' organisation told us, that process of going around and doing that can be highly traumatic for some people. And so it can pose real challenges in terms of accessing the scheme. Next slide, please. If you do demonstrate your eligibility for the scheme and you're given access, you go through a process to develop a plan to work out what your support needs might look like. And here you need to be able to know your strengths and limitations, and in terms of how you want to, what your best life is that you want to live, and be able to communicate these. And for formerly incarcerated people, as Sophie's already talked about, that can be somewhat of a challenge, and particularly if you've managed to get through life despite the system, acknowledging your limitations can be a challenging process for some people. Now, of course, you don't have to go into planning processes on your own, and you can take along supporters who can help you identify and communicate those needs. But a lot of interviewees told us that people would often take in a friend or a family member, and generally somebody who wasn't necessarily very familiar with either the NDIS or disability services. And that can be a challenge because it doesn't necessarily help people along those processes. Now, what you can take in is a support coordinator. But again, you need to know that you're eligible for a support coordinator. Not everybody knows that. But there are also specialist support coordinators in this area who have particular skills and insight around formerly incarcerated people. But getting hold of one of those and knowing that you need one can be somewhat of a challenge. Next slide, please. Now then, if you get a plan, that's great, but there are challenges in knowing how to use that. So you've got to be able to identify providers that you want to work with, and engage them for the services that you want them to deliver in relation to your NDIS package. And so one program coordinator from a disability organisation told us that, you can't just send people off with an NDIS package and think they're going to be okay, because most of the time they're not. So it's a difficult process to navigate and to work out how to secure those services. And it also has real implications. So we know that, plans are regularly reviewed, usually every year, maybe every 2 years, depending on what arrangements you're on. And one of the implications of not spending money on services in your plan is that when it's reviewed, you may be seen as not needing that money. So you didn't spend that because you didn't need those services anymore, and not because you couldn't find appropriate services. So you may lose that money in subsequent planning processes. And the final issue, and again, Sophie kind of touched on this a bit already in the context of prisons, is while this idea that choice and control is a really great idea and is something that should drive these services, we also need to remember it's not just the clients who have choice and control. Providers also have an element of that. And so people that we spoke to talked about real gaps in the market in terms of specialist skills and expertise in working with formerly incarcerated people with disability. And so people would find that they would work with a provider, but then if their behaviours of concern emerged, they would kind of drop them. They'd say, okay, you're not going to have services from us anymore. And a couple of people talked about having seen instances where clients had big packages. So they had large amounts of money to work with them. And so the provider thought, great, we'll go in and deliver those services there. But as soon as people exhibit challenging behaviours, then they would disengage from those services. And so there's a real gap in the market in terms of those specialist expertise, and often in many areas, no provider of last resort. So if you don't get access from those providers, then where do you go for your service support? Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on now and talk about the implications of this research, and there are many that we could potentially talk about around this, but I'll talk a little bit about policy and practice, and then about areas for further research. Now, one of the themes, obviously, that we've talked about is being able to identify people with disability in prison would be a really helpful way as starting some of this process and putting supports in place. We don't have that. There isn't a consistent screening tool that's used, but at a very least, one of the things we could do is identify people who have NDIS plans. And so, would presumably be in the 12% of people with disability who have significant and permanent impairments, and so therefore in need of NDIS support. There's also a need for improved training and development for corrections staff around human rights, but how we support people in a non-discriminatory and respectful way. And the importance of that is that's not just of a benefit to people with disability, but the broader population of prisons, as too is the recommendation that we modify prison-based behaviour change and education programmes so that they are delivered in plain English or easy read, so that people can complete those programmes. The benefit there would not just be to people with disability, but people with English as a second language, or people with low literacy skills as well. As we've talked about, there is a kind of a policy framework around this space, but it's not always been implemented in a clear and a consistent way. So there's also some need to work on the kind of knowledge and skills that are needed to be able to implement that policy and deliver that vision for those services. Next slide, please. Advocacy is a real area that I know many people who are here will be concerned about, and we've seen a general retreat from the funding of advocacy services by state and territory governments since the advent of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But we know that it's really important for people both to access services within prison, but also in post-release as well. So the new government has committed to investing more funds in advocacy services, and it would be great to see some of that go into specialist advocacy in this space. this issue, and it's not easily untangled between kind of behaviours that are criminogenic and behaviours that are related to disability. I mean, it may not be possible to disentangle these two for funding decisions, but that shouldn't stop people from getting appropriate services being delivered. So some specialist thought given to how we untangle some of that and deal with those issues as they arise are needed. As to our greater availability of specialist support coordinators, so formerly incarcerated people with disability who are eligible for the NDIS can move through that system. And finally, in terms of policy and practice, we really need to think about this issue of market stewardship and about who's the provider who's going to be available if individuals can't engage with the existing providers and they don't have the specialist expertise to work with formerly incarcerated people with disability. Next slide, please. And finally, further research. A really significant limitation of the research that we've done is that we talk to people in the system, so people in government organisations, people in not-for-profits, and we've got some great insight from that, but we haven't talked to people with disability within the scheme. So people with disability have been the kind of the objects of the research rather than the active subjects, and so we'd really like to follow this up with some research that really kind of talk to people with disability going through these systems and to understand from their perspective what some of the issues are and whether they marry up with those that of the experts that we've talked to. And as we've also talked about a few times, there's a real need to get better evidence base around both the types of supports that we can put in place to identify and support people with disability so that they're not criminalised due to behaviours associated with their disabilities, and what would look like an effective experience and pathway through the criminal justice system, and that support people from entering into that cycle of being incarcerated and released and re-incarcerated. So that's it for our implications for now, and I'll hand back over to Caroline.
Thanks so much, Shannon, Sophie and Helen. So what I'll do now is hand over to Mindy, who'll provide some insights into, I guess, what organisations working on the ground can really do to better support people with disability involved with the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And sorry, I'm just trying to hide the chaos of my desktop while I share my screen with you. Thank you so much to all of the previous presenters. I also want to acknowledge that I am on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also want to pay my respects to the lands that you are all onto the elders of those lands, as well as to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are on the call today. I also, I did that terrifying thing that you do as a presenter and looked at the participants that were on the call, and I feel that it would be remiss to not also acknowledge just the wealth of expertise and experience, some advocates especially in the space of disability and human rights, and working with people in prison that have been doing it for 1,000 years, possibly not quite 1,000 years, but Jim Simpson, Alison Churchill, Peter McGillivray, there's a whole bunch of people on the call that know this space inside out. I guess what I want to do is very briefly talk about the report and the excellent sort of findings of the report, and then move on a little bit to talk about how we might use this information in an advocacy and reform sense. So I guess that what this report does is it raises these really critical issues around the intersection of disability and the criminal justice system, specifically in relation to the NDIS, the promise of the NDIS. And I guess the way that that promise has in so many ways been unable to be realised for populations who are also in the criminal justice system. So I guess that one of the real values of this report is that it does elevate and centre the expertise of professionals, so people who are practitioners but deeply, deeply embedded within the practices of the NDIS and corrections and other intersecting systems. And I guess that who experience, alongside the individuals that they are working with, they experience the sort of failures and successes of the NDIS and know this in a really grounded sort of way in terms of what's working and what's not working. And the value of this knowledge is immense. And I think, especially for people who are not necessarily as connected to the front line, because it is often the case, I think, that the expertise of practitioners, which I have to say often seems so obvious to the people that are in those roles because it's just part of a daily practice, is not often given this kind of space in academic work, but it's here. And of course, as the researchers have been at pains to point it out, alongside the voices of people who have themselves got lived experience of disability in the justice system, it's alongside these voices that we actually can, I guess, formulate out of these very individual stories a structural sort of analysis of the system, alongside some very sensible suggestions about what we might do to fix things when they're not working, because often it is practitioners and people who have lived it themselves that actually have those answers, because they're always looking for the solutions and for the ways to make things work. So the report elevates really important systemic issues, the regular failure to identify people with disabilities in custodial settings, also in police stations and courts, all criminal justice system settings, the absence of accessibility to adequate disability supports for people who are in prison, and also the absence of kind of adequate through care or post-release support for people with disabilities who are leaving prisons. And it also raises, I guess, really critical questions about how it is that we treat people with disabilities when we send them to prison, and proposes a very sort of interesting frame of kind of institutional thoughtlessness to assist in our understanding of this. But alongside this, it also, the report asks us to think through the question of why it is that people in prison are not afforded the same sort of access to disability supports or healthcare as people on the outside community. So I'm just going to park that there for a tick. But I guess that the question that I want to elevate and that I want to pose on top of all of this is the question of, well, why are we sending so many people with disabilities to prison in the first place? Because although, of course, the task of improving identification of disability for people that are in the criminal justice system and improving access to disability services, as well as looking at the critical issues of people with disabilities and access post-release, that are all important, and we need to have them at all of our sort of the centre of all of our thinking when we're talking about advocacy strategies. I want to expand our lens out a little bit and look at the use of imprisonment itself, because I think that what we need to do is look at the way that people with disabilities are actually punished in criminal justice system settings rather than being supported. And think about this not just through a human rights and disability lens, although of course we need to have those frameworks, but also just through a really pragmatic sort of efficacy and community safety lens, given what we know about prison and imprisonment's failure. Given what all the evidence shows us in terms of prison actually exacerbating disadvantage rather than ameliorating it, why do we continue to send so many people with disabilities to prison? And is there a different sort of way to think about the use of imprisonment? I guess that what we see in this report, and I guess I'll go to the next slide, but what we see sort of not just with people with disabilities, but so often for people in the criminal justice system who are being managed in that setting rather than being supported in the community, we see these amazing sort of individuals themselves who are going through the system, as well as amazing workers and practitioners, both in government and in non-government services, who come up with these workarounds. So what we see in this report is that often when things are going well for people, it's because they've got advocates or practitioners or support workers who are somehow able to sort of trick the system to ensure that the person with the disability actually has access to the things that they need and has genuine sort of opportunity to access support. So someone maybe happens to have a family member who's a great advocate who happens to notify corrections that their person is in prison and has a disability, and maybe that prison happens to have a worker who's really responsive to a family member, and maybe there happens to be a bed in the specialist unit, and maybe, you know, that person then is going to get a really sort of okay level of support. But I guess what the report shows again, and I guess this is again what those of us who have been working in the space for a long time know, is that these failings are systemic, and the systemic stories of failure are much more common than any stories of success. What we need to do is flip that. So I've sort of, I guess as a starting point, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm just going to make sure that I absolutely don't go beyond that. But as a starting point, we need to start imagining a completely different kind of system. And this sounds like a radical vision, but that's only because the system that we've got at the moment is really broken. So imagine if everybody who had a disability actually had really straightforward access to the supports that they required, regardless of whether or not they were in prison or not. Imagine if every single person that needed access to drug and alcohol support was actually able to access this at the moment that they were motivated to do so. Imagine if everybody who was homeless when they turned up at court, or homeless on release from custody, actually had somewhere to live, or if people with mental health conditions were able to access support, or if everybody who actually really wanted access to education was able to do this. I'm putting that there because we've become so accustomed to a system where, rather than these things being really obvious systemic responses to the drivers of incarceration, when these things happen, it often has required a huge amount of work, both on the part of the individual who's made those things happen and on the part of their worker. So I want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about how we might reduce the numbers of people going to prison in Australia. And I'm not going to spend too long talking about the Justice Reform Initiative, except to say that relatively new advocacy organisation, absolutely committed to working with people who are working in disabilities, people who are working in homelessness, people who are working in drug and alcohol, because I guess at the heart of what we're trying to do is build a community in which disadvantage is no longer met with a criminal justice system response. So we've got this very ambitious target to reduce incarceration by 50% before 2030. And we've got a whole range of different ways we want to do that. But I guess before we talk about some of those strategies and strategies that advocates, practitioners, people working with the NDIS, people working in prisons, what some of the things are that we might do, I think it's useful to just again step back a little bit, look at what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So very briefly, we overuse imprisonment. We've got it as this default measure that we use to both try and address crime, and this default system to manage complex disadvantage. However, all the research shows us that, of course, prisons do not work at all to do either of those things. We also know there is a systemic failure to address the underlying social determinants of contact with the criminal justice system, and certainly for people with disabilities, as again, many participants on this call are so aware of. If you were born with a disability into disadvantage compared to if you were born with a disability and you live in an affluent area, your life trajectories are entirely different. And if you were born into some particular communities where there are high rates of over-policing, where there are high rates of criminalisation, chances are that your disability is not going to get picked up or responded to until you're in contact with the justice system. We failed to address the social determinants of contact with the criminal justice system. This is something obviously that people have been saying for well over 30 years in Australia in terms of reports. We've also got on the top of this idea, this problem, this political problem, which is that being perceived to be tough on crime for all political parties has become a very convenient politically accepted strategy in response to crime. And that's fueled by a particular way of reporting crime, which tends to dehumanize and perpetuates this idea that actually prison works to do the things that we imagine it might. And then we've got this final thing, which is despite an extraordinary body of evidence, and this report absolutely comes into this body of evidence. Despite this evidence, we've got this very limited commitment or awareness even about how we might build genuine alternatives to prisons or pathways out of prison on the part of policymakers and the general public. So I've just got a couple more minutes, but I guess in order to think about how we might translate this evidence into political appetite, I think that there's a couple of things that we need to do. We need to sort of know that the evidence is there, and we need to keep building it and keep elevating it. But we also know that there are things that we can do that are already happening, often on a very small scale, that can absolutely and dramatically disrupt trajectories into the criminal justice system and also stop the cycle of criminal justice system involvement. There's evidence for the efficacy of particular sorts of pre-charge diversion, of specialist courts, of post-release work, of disability supports that really give people an opportunity to actually live outside in the community. We've got restorative and transformative justice models, again, that have a huge amount of research behind them. We know there's an evidence base, including an alarming evidence base about prisons harms, but what I guess we're lacking is resourcing of the things that work and political will. So the Justice Reform Initiative has identified 4 strategies, big picture strategies for bringing about change, including the importance of systematic political advocacy. We need to absolutely change the political conversation so that there's not a competition to see who can be the toughest on crime. We need to change the public conversation. At the moment, most people outside of the worlds in which we work, most people in Australia think that prison works to do the things that it says it does. People think that it works to rehabilitate, that it works to deter. So we need to actually really challenge that public conversation about the efficacy of prison. We need to increase public awareness and support so many, many more people are engaged in this work to reduce the legitimacy of imprisonment as a response to disadvantage and as a response to many kinds of crime. We need to be working together as well. So there's not a magic reform fix. I've just got a minute left, so I'll finish up very quickly, but there's not a magic reform fix. There's a whole range of different things that we can do. Some are legislative reform, say raising the age of criminal responsibility. Some are around resourcing the community sector. Some are around post-release. Some are obviously around disability support. Some options will involve expanding or scaling up programs and services, and other things. Other times we might need to try new things. So there's a need for these multiple legislative, social, health and disability and human service reforms to be enacted so that we can have a situation where historically over-incarcerated and disadvantaged populations genuinely have opportunities to thrive in the community. And this is just a very brief, what do we do? And so maybe we can talk about this, but I don't want this expanding the lens out to reducing incarceration to diminish in any way the work that I know so many people that are part of this and that I've certainly been part of, this work and the intersection between disability and criminal justice. This work needs to continue. So we need to keep up the solid advocacy and service delivery work. For service delivery providers, whether that's legal practitioners or NDIS providers, know that change takes time, and please keep doing the amazing sort of individual advocacy work that you're doing. But I guess that what I think is also really useful is to feed into advocacy organisations so that people that are funded to do the kinds of jumping up and down, to do the political piece of advocacy, to do the public facing work, are really connected with both people with disabilities who are in the system as well as practitioners on the ground, so that we can actually really tell the story of what's not working. There's a whole range of things that you can do in terms of joining the sort of jailing is failing movement, but you can check out the website to do that. Thank you so much. I'll hand back to Caroline now.
Thank you, Mindy. So what I might do is we've got a couple of minutes just left over for questions. So I might hand over to Fiona if she wants to sort of let us know about some of the questions that have come through on the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I actually think we've been answering the questions okay as we've been going. There's some really interesting commentary in there about, I guess, with ideas for future research as well. So I think that's just something as a team that we need to be thinking about. So I don't know if other team members, if there's particular questions that strike you as being important to respond to. I mean, there's interesting points about, did we undertake a gendered analysis, which I think for some team members that would be particularly appealing. There was a question actually, could people access NDIS services under their plan when they were on remand?
Yes.
So yeah, Shannon, do you want to talk to that?
Yes, sure. So it wasn't a specific focus in our research, but certainly a few interviewees did raise this as an issue. And just like Sophie said in the chat, some of our interviewees said, look, the situation's even worse if you're a woman, if you're Indigenous, or if you're on remand. So speaking to remand specifically, there is a lot of uncertainty for individuals on remand. We may not know yet if they are going to be sentenced. If they are going to be sentenced, we don't know what the sentence length is going to be. And often they are held in specific remand centres, so we don't know what prison or facility they're going to end up in. And so the culmination of those issues means that often someone with a disability who is on remand may actually be even more likely to fall through the gaps and have their disability support needs unmet, because they're kind of seen as a bit of a temporary entity potentially. And until we know more about where they're going to end up and for how long, not much attention is actually being paid to, well, what supports do they require?
And I would also add that as far as the NDIS rules go, as far as I'm aware, and this is what people said, people's NDIS services are cut off when they go into remand, just the same as when they're sentenced. So they can't get the day-to-day supports that they might have got if they had an NDIS plan in the community. But as far as transition supports back into the community go, those can generally only start being organised 6 months before a person has a release date. And if they're on remand, they obviously don't have a release date yet. So that was an issue that came up a lot. People who, not only on remand, but people who didn't have a set release date, how could people know when even to start trying to get their NDIS transition services organised?
Thanks, Soph and Shannon. Shannon, I've got another question for you as well. There was one in the chat about how did we access people to participate in the study with some difficulties faced with another area of work. So my recollection is we did use contacts as much as possible, but you found some challenges yourself, didn't you? Is there any suggestions or tips you've got for how to work around those challenges for others?
Sure. So really at the beginning, we brainstormed as a group to say, who are the key organisations, individuals working in this space? Who would we love to have participate and really have their input? So in addition to grabbing some of our contacts and letting them know about this important research, would you like to participate? Is there anyone you know who could participate? I also just got in touch with different organisations and let them know about what we were doing, the type of people we would like to speak with. Sometimes that required a follow-up email or telephone call. We were collecting data right in the thick of lockdowns and COVID, and that was quite difficult. But with some perseverance, we found that often with the follow-up that someone would come back to us and say, yes, I can participate, or I can refer you to someone who can. So persevere and work out who are the key individuals and organizations who can really help you in this space, and try again.
Thanks, Shannon. And there's also a comment, a question by Satish, which I think will probably be in Soph's domain, which is how different is the level of access to services for participants in the NDIS in prison versus those in specialist disability accommodation? That wasn't an area that we touched on, was it, Sophie? But are there any insights you have based on your analysis?
No, that wasn't an issue that we covered in our paper, but I might just ask Helen if anything sparked there.
Thanks, Sophie. I mean, it's obviously an area that's a big gap, and one that the NDIS is having a look at the moment. I'm not sure I'd ever describe prisons as specialist disability accommodation. I think there's enough evidence to demonstrate that they're not. In terms of our work, but clearly needs to be lots of work done there to make sure that they're more appropriate, if not completely diverted in the first place, as Mindy talked about really eloquently.
Thanks, Helen. And while we have you on the screen, there is a question, which is, what's the one thing community support coordinators should know about working with incarcerated participants? Do you want to share any insights you have into that?
Yeah, if there's any one thing, it's that people are different and have different aims and priorities, and so there isn't just one thing that everybody would experience. But I think one of the key points that Mindy talked about is where we come across people with disability in these contexts, often that's not just the one thing about their identity or their life that's important. We know that people with disability are less likely to complete education, are less likely to work, are more likely to be socioeconomically disadvantaged and face poorer health outcomes, and that's because of a number of structural drivers and systemic kind of inequities that people face. So I think thinking about those issues in terms of intersectionalities, and not just thinking about kind of a disability response or others, is a real thing we need to think of. The new Australian disability strategy has many strengths to it in thinking about how we better support people with disability. But often those issues are separated into different life domains. And as we've talked about here today a number of times, it's not very easy to put people's lives into administrative boxes, and it raises a series of challenges and issues for people. And we see today some of the outcomes of that, with people being, incarcerated when there may be alternative kind of routes. So people are inherently different, but everybody, but we need to think about intersectional disadvantage as well. Sorry, the dog is trying to give some answers to this question, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Helen. And I was going to throw it to you as well, but maybe Sophie or you can answer this. We'll sneak in one more question. Ella's asked, as allied health providers, what is our role here? How can we help? How can we ensure that services are reaching those who need them in prison? So Sophie, did you want to answer that one? Any thoughts?
Actually, I want to throw to Mindy, because Mindy knows a lot more about this than I do, and she hasn't had a chance to answer any questions yet.
And do you know what? I was just like totally caught unawares because I was looking at a couple of messages that had come through. What was the question?
It was about making sure, or helping allied health professionals access people in prison to help them with transition services and so on, making sure that they can actually access people in prison.
Yep. So a couple of things. Firstly, building relationships with local prisons is often a little bit easier than building relationships with the institution of corrections. And there's great people working on the ground in prisons. So getting to know who those people are can be really helpful. The second thing is probably not make no assumptions about what has or hasn't happened for the person when they're inside. It's sometimes remarkable and remarkably surprising for people that aren't in prisons a lot to understand the absolute lack of support and care and access to things that you would imagine would be fundamental. So I guess for people that are allied health professionals on the outside that are wanting to support people in prison, I would say, please, go for it, because there's such a need. Work with the local prisons and become advocates, for people inside, because people in prison are they happen to be in that particular setting, but they're people like anybody else. So there shouldn't actually be a difference in the way in which the support is provided.
Fantastic. Well, what we might do there is wrap up, because it's just past 1 o'clock. So I'll just remind people that the link to the report is in the chat. And thank again everyone, for all of our participants, for all of their insights during 2021. And thank again Mindy for providing her insights today during the discussion. So thank you everyone. Goodbye.